Thank you, Des. Clear call to action there. I'd now like to invite Rebecca Smith to the stage. Rebecca manages the Conservation Evidence Project that Des mentioned to the University of Cambridge, which collates scientific information about the effectiveness of actions for habitats to make it easily available to decision makers. Previously, Rebecca worked as a senior ecological consultant in the UK, and before that carried out research relating to conservation issues and resulting in the development of management strategies for declining and endangered species.
Thank you very much, Mark. So some great presentations so far this morning, and I'm going to touch on some of the points that have been made and go into a bit more detail, perhaps address some of those. So hopefully we all agree it's vital to consider evidence when you're planning projects to ensure that you're carrying out effective mitigation. And studies show that using the evidence does make a big difference. So for example, in an evidence-based wing of a hospital compared to a traditional wing, it reduced deaths by 1/5 and hospital stays by almost 1/3. Evidence-based aviation safety practices have led to a 5 to 10-fold reduction in annual fatalities and so on. So it really makes a difference. Despite this, in conservation practice, studies show that often decisions are made without looking at the evidence of the effectiveness of actions. And of course, that leads to potentially ineffective or harmful action, a false sense of security. You think you're doing something that's going to benefit biodiversity, but the evidence might suggest otherwise. Potentially wasted time and money, and also reputational risk. So as a community of practice, it's more important than ever to show that you're carrying out effective action, being able to demonstrate that you are doing that. And so just a bit more of an introduction, it's been mentioned already today, but what we do at Conservation Evidence. So we work with practitioners, policymakers, funders, and so on to address the barriers to using evidence and to generating evidence. So we've worked with over 1,000 people, and we co-design solutions to overcome some of these barriers. So we've produced this evidence toolkit, so that's tools, resources, processes, and so on that can help you to embed evidence in practice. And so one of our main outputs, which has been mentioned already, we collate the scientific evidence of the effectiveness of conservation actions and make it readily available for those making decisions. So we've reviewed over 4,000 actions so far, so we've summarised 9,000 studies for that. We're now using AI to do that, so we're starting to speed things up. And that's all free to use, and you can search for your species, the action you're interested in, habitats, and so on. But of course, because we collate the evidence, we can see how many gaps there are. And so each of these bars is one of the synopses of evidence that we've produced. So there's more than that, this is just a selection. But you can see from that, on average, 40% of the actions that you might do to benefit that species group or habitat has no evidence. And so decisions are being made without evidence of effectiveness at the moment. So we need to build tests of action in practice. We completely understand that there are barriers to that, as have been mentioned already, but we want to build a realistic vision for embedding tests in practice. So I'm going to cover thinking about how you can find knowledge gaps that matter to you, opportunities to learn through testing, asking the right sort of question that is actually answerable, and how to design a study. So there are 3 requirements, we think, to finding good opportunities to test, and Nancy Ockenden et al. Have produced a diagram that helps with this. First of all, is an action actually being carried out? And would the results of a test of the effectiveness of that action help to inform your future management? Or it might be to inform others in the conservation community to help them to carry out more effective action. First of all, of course, it's worth looking at the existing evidence base, so using conservation evidence and other sources. If there's a huge evidence base already available, it might not be the best thing to test. But if there's a gap or it hasn't been tested for your species group or habitat, then that might be a good opportunity to test this action. And just to say that, as Gemma mentioned earlier, when you're thinking about looking for evidence that exists, Looking at guidance is not necessarily the answer. We carried out the study of 300 guidance documents from 50 organisations in the UK and Ireland and found that only 9% of those had references to back up the recommendations they were giving, which means you don't know whether the recommendations within guidance are based on scientific evidence or it's just someone's opinion. So anyway, you've looked at the evidence base and let's say there is a gap there. The next thing to think about is, do you have the skills in order to be able to design a test, carry out the analysis and so on? If not, then perhaps you can collaborate, as has already been mentioned. And then the next thing is, can a robust test be embedded in management, in the management that you're already going to be carrying out? So we're not thinking about necessarily designing a whole new research project. This is more about, if you're carrying out an action, is there a site variation that you might be able to test at the same time to see if there's something that you could be a better way of doing it? So, as Bill Sutherland would always say, there's always a better way of doing everything. There's always it's worth trying variations. So if all of those three things are there, then it's a good opportunity to test. So the next thing to think about is asking the right sort of question. So you might have a very exciting question, but if it's going to require 3 PhD students and take you 10 years to answer, it's not necessarily the right thing to be thinking about. Keep it simple. So if it's a simple question, it's more likely you're going to be able to answer that question with the resources, skills you have, and so on. And we've created guidance on creating testable questions to carry out in practice. And we've got a list of 100 questions there, so that was generated with practitioners. And those are all questions that we think could be answered with just a couple of days or a couple of weeks' worth of work. And we think there are 4 main opportunities for finding testable questions. So first of all, you might want to challenge a claim. So, for example, the guidance says to install nest boxes at 3 metres, but is that really the best height? And so a similar sort of project was looking at a traditional bird box design and found that actually a deeper bird box was better for most species. You might want to solve a problem. So this was a problem that the Vincent Wildlife Trust came up against, and so they came up with a solution and tested that. You might want to refine or improve your practices. So, for example, you're installing bee bricks, but what's the best height? Which is the best colour? And again, this was a study that was carried out in collaboration with a company that was making these bee bricks. Or seize big opportunities, as we just heard about with the solar panels. You might be restoring lots of meadows, and you might be able to look at 2 different seed mixtures in plots throughout those meadows to see which is best. And in all of these examples, we're just thinking about a slight variation to the implementation method. Nothing very complicated. So then we need to think about the design of a test of an action. So you've formulated your question. Then for a robust study, you want to just be changing one variable at a time with everything else being constant, so that you can be more confident that any change you see is due to the change in that variable. And in order to see a change, you need a comparison. So you need to define what your comparison is. So it might be that you're monitoring before you carry out the action and after, or at sites with and without the action. Ideally, you'd have both of those. Or you might be comparing a variation in the implementation method, for example. So then you're going to design your study. So you're going to think about which sites, how you're going to allocate the treatment and control, which ideally would be randomized. Think about what data you're going to collect, when you're going to collect it, how often, and so on. Then you're going to implement your action and gather the data, and analyze and write that up. And very importantly, ideally, you're going to publish those results so that others can learn from what you've learnt by testing the action. And Nancy Ockenden, that I mentioned earlier, she's produced the guidance on effectively integrating experiments in practice. And that's thinking about practical approaches to designing experiments. So completely understanding that in conservation, things aren't simple. You're not going to have a huge number of replicates and so on. So it's worth having a look at that. And also we've published this book, Transforming Conservation, Practical Guide to Evidence and Decision Making, and chapter 10 within that is all about generating evidence. So again, somewhere else to look for more information about designing tests. So just a very simple example, your question might be, does fertilising or mulching saplings lead to higher survival? And that might be useful for your future practice. So I'm not quite sure why this has been split, but anyway, first of all, you need to think about your comparison. So you're going to plant some without any thing added, and then some you're going to add the mulch or fertiliser to. You're going to design your study. So you're going to think about, so it might be a hedge you're restoring or creating, or it might be a line of trees and so on. You're going to pick a section where you're not going to add anything, a section that you're going to add the fertiliser, mulch, whatever to. You need a gap between those. And of course, you need to make sure that everything else is kept constant. So you're going to have the same planting density in each of those, same species planted at the same time, and so on. And then you're going to monitor. So in this case, let's say after a year, you're going to go back and see how many survived in each of these. And of course, ideally, you'd be replicating this. So you'd have a number of hedgerows, lines of trees, or whatever. And ideally, you would allocate those to the control and treatment randomly, so that you've got a randomised, replicated, controlled study. You're then going to monitor that. So we said after a year, you're going to go back and see the survival in each of the plots. And then you're going to analyse those results and write them up. And if you design a good experiment at the beginning, then it makes it much easier to analyse and to write up at the end. And then, very importantly, share those results so that the rest of the conservation community also learns from what you've done. And so just to mention, we created the Conservation Evidence Journal. So this is specifically for practitioners to publish the results of tests of actions. Free to publish in and read. We want it to be a very simple paper. It can be as short as 1 page. We just want to know what you did and what happened. There's a template to help with that. It must be a test of an action. And if you carry out lots of actions at the same time, which often happens in projects, and then you monitor that, it doesn't really tell us anything. We've no idea which of those actions had any impact. So in summary, you need to think about the things that you really want to know about. So what could make a difference to your future practice or to others? Can you design a test to find the answer to that? And again, you want to be keeping that simple. And then ideally, you're going to be sharing those results so that others can learn. So you're going to be adding to that evidence base and then improving practice. So just to end with, this is a diagram from Mossy Earth, which is a funder who's actually funding innovative tests of actions. This is to think about what you're doing. So if there's a very weak evidence base, or you're not even checking the evidence, and you haven't got experimental design, then what you're actually doing is guessing when you're carrying out action on the ground. You're not going to learn anything, and you may well be carrying out ineffective actions. So the evidence might say that it's not effective, but if you haven't looked, you don't know that. If there's a robust evidence base that you've looked at, and you've got, and there's no experimental design in what you're doing, that's okay, because you've looked at the evidence, it suggests it's effective, and then you're going to carry out that action. If there's a weak evidence base, or you haven't looked, but you're carrying out a robust experimental design, then you're testing, which is fantastic. So you're learning, and you're going to share those results with others, so they also learn from that. It may well be that you find out that the action is not effective, but that's equally important. And as Debbie mentioned earlier, it's very important to publish the results when things don't work as well. And in the Conservation Evidence Journal, we're very happy to have those results because it is important for others to know when things don't work as well. If there's a robust evidence base and you're carrying out a robust study, then what you're doing is refining. And that's fine. And if it suggests that it's going to be effective, you're carrying out, you're likely to have good outcomes. But perhaps the resources you're using to test that could be better placed testing something where there's not very much evidence. Okay, thank you. And just to mention, so that Mark doesn't have to do it for me, we've got an Evidence Champion programme. So it's a network of practitioners, funders and others that can demonstrate that they use evidence in practice and generate evidence. So I'm going to be talking at 1:05 in Highgrove, just explaining what that is and how you could become part of that if you're interested. Okay, thank you.